The air in the old workshop feels colder than the morning outside, as if the building has held its breath for decades. Dust hangs in suspended currents that shift only when the door opens, letting in the faint smell of damp metal and forgotten wood. The floorboards respond with a low groan under each step, a reminder that every part of this place has aged in silence. Nothing in here looks touched, moved, or disturbed. And yet something waits beneath the stillness. A narrow beam of daylight falls across the concrete, revealing flakes of green paint scattered near a sunken patch of plywood. The surface warps upward at one corner, almost imperceptibly, as though time has been pushing from underneath. A gloved hand brushes the dust aside. The plywood flexes with a hollow note, different from the solid planks surrounding it, and the sound cuts through the room like a quiet alarm. Another hand reaches for the edge. The sheet lifts, releasing a breath of stale, trapped air from a chamber that has not opened since the early years of this city's transformation. A ladder descends into the dark, the rungs cold with age. A moment passes before the first step is taken downward, into a space that feels separated from the world above by more than distance. Down here, the air is heavier, tinged with the faint mineral smell of concrete, slowly shedding itself over time. A shape emerges in the dimness, a rectangular outline pressed against the far wall. The beam of a flashlight finds chipped metal, flaked green, mottled with brown where rust is eaten through the original surface. A storage trunk, sealed with a small padlock that has corroded into a brittle loop of iron. Dust blankets the lid so evenly that it forms a perfect skin, undisturbed by rodents, moisture, or human hands. Whatever rests inside has slept without witness. The flashlight drifts over the lid, illuminating a faint pattern, the ghost of an old shipping label long peeled away. There is no writing left, no clues on the surface, just a suggestion that this trunk once traveled, or once belonged somewhere other than this forgotten basement. The quiet stretches, amplifying the sense that crossing this threshold will pull something long buried into the present. Metal echoes softly when the lock is lifted with a slow, deliberate pressure. The brittle loop snaps, falling to the floor in two pieces. The lid hesitates, stuck by years of settled grit. When it finally gives way, it releases a muted rasp, as though the past is reluctantly opening its mouth. Inside, the first impression is color, a faded blue that once might have been brighter. A child's shoe rests near the top, its canvas worn smooth, its white stripe dulled into ivory by age. Beside it lies a folded page torn from a sketchbook. The crayon marks, though faint, still trace the outline of a harbor with uneven lines and small waves, drawn by an unsteady hand. Beneath the paper, a small cloth pouch reveals the weight of marbles, their glass still clear despite the years. None of these items should be here. They belong to another place, another life, one that disappeared without explanation. The cold in the room deepens, not from temperature, but from recognition. These objects were once part of a morning routine, carried by someone who never returned home. Now they sit quietly inside a trunk that has hidden them for 35 years. The discovery is not loud. It is not dramatic. It unfolds in silence so complete that it seems to absorb even the breath of the person who opened the lid. Yet the impact is unmistakable. This is the kind of silence that closes a door behind you, sealing the present to the past. The objects are lifted carefully, placed inside new evidence bags that crinkle sharply in the stillness. Each one carries the weight of a life cut short, a routine interrupted, a family frozen in grief. Each one connects to a story that once dominated the fears of a neighborhood, then slowly faded into the fog of years without resolution. But stories like this do not stay hidden forever. Sometimes they lie dormant until someone asks the right question, or notices the wrong detail, or simply refuses to let the silence remain undisturbed. The moment these items leave the trunk, the air in the basement changes, as though the room recognizes the shift from secrecy to revelation. The weight of what has been found is not yet understood, not fully, but it is enough. Enough to break open a dormant case. Enough to reawaken memories in families who long ago stopped expecting answers. Enough to pull a vanished child back into the light, not through hope, but through evidence that refuses to be forgotten. To understand how this began, we go back to 1981. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. Most mornings in the Marin loft began with the same soft routine, a rhythm shaped by sunlight filtering through the tall windows and settling over the mismatched furniture that the family had collected through years of living on a modest budget. The building had once been a storage warehouse, but artists and young families had moved into the unused upper floors, giving the place a lived-in charm. In one corner, a stack of canvases leaned against the brick, and in another sat a small desk crowded with jars of crayons, blunt pencils, and a clutter of hand-drawn pages. This corner belonged entirely to 6-year-old Caleb Marin, whose world was a blend of imagination, curiosity, and the simple joy of observing the streets below. He liked waking early. Before anyone else stirred, he would push aside the curtain and peer at the market square where vendors slowly unpacked their stands and delivery trucks rumbled past the cobblestones. He would often whisper a greeting to the day, even when no one heard him. His mother, Dana, would always find him perched on the windowsill when she rose, his legs swinging as he studied the world outside, as if it were a story he hoped to memorize. Breakfast was usually toast with berry jam and a small cup of warm milk. Caleb had a habit of shaping his toast into little boats before eating them, pretending each one was traveling across a wide ocean. His father, Hugh, often joked that the boy would grow up to become a sailor or an artist, depending on which part of his imagination won. Caleb didn't answer those remarks directly. He would simply smile, as though the idea of choosing only one future felt unfair when the world seemed full of possibilities. What stood out most about Caleb was his sense of independence. He wasn't reckless, merely confident. He liked the idea of doing small things on his own, tying his shoelaces, packing his sketchbook, counting the loose marbles he kept in a cloth pouch and carefully placing them in his coat pocket as if they were companions rather than toys. Each marble carried a small story. The green one reminded him of the algae-covered stones by the old pier. The blue one reminded him of the sky above the harbor on a rare, clear day. And the orange one reminded him of the market lanterns hung during the summer festival. He handled them with the care usually reserved for treasured gifts. His room was small but full of small rituals. Every night, he placed a drawing on his desk so it would be the first thing he saw in the morning. Every morning, he rearranged the 4 tiny wooden animals on his shelf: a deer, a bear, a bird, and a fox in a new formation, as though creating a silent story only he could understand. These little acts made him feel anchored, and his parents indulged them because they saw how much these habits shaped his sense of self. Northside Harbor in 1981 was a neighborhood in transition. Old brick warehouses coexisted with art studios, coffee carts, and local craftsmen who greeted children by name. People watched out for one another, or at least believed they did. The market square was always the center of morning activity, and Caleb adored walking through it with his mother on weekends. The colors, the noise, the mingling aromas of pastry and sawdust fascinated him. But on school days, his world was quieter and more methodical, following a predictable route to the bus stop that was only a short distance from home. It was this routine that shaped the final days before his disappearance. Caleb had recently asked his parents if he could walk to the bus on his own. He had argued his case in that earnest, determined way children do when they believe they are ready for something new. After much discussion, Dana and Hugh agreed, with the condition that they would watch him from the window until he reached the end of the block. Caleb accepted these terms with pride that seemed almost too large for his small frame. The night before his final walk, he spent extra time packing his bag. He selected a single sheet of paper torn from his sketchbook, the one with the unfinished drawing of the harbor. He tucked it carefully between his school folders. When his father asked why he wanted that one in particular, Caleb shrugged, saying he might finish it during recess. His father smiled and ruffled his hair, unaware that this drawing would later become one of the last personal artifacts he ever touched. Dana remembered that evening with unusual clarity. Caleb had appeared especially content, humming softly as he lined up his marbles on the kitchen table. He polished each one using the hem of his shirt, creating tiny reflections of the overhead light. It was a small ritual, one that calmed him. When he placed them back into his pouch, he tied the strings tight, a habit he had learned from watching his mother secure grocery bags. He said goodnight earlier than usual, curling beneath his blanket with the wooden fox tucked beside him. The morning of his disappearance began with sunlight pale and diffused through low clouds. The loft felt colder than usual, but Caleb didn't seem to notice. He was dressed before his mother finished making breakfast, eager to begin what he saw as another step toward independence. He ate quickly, leaving a small smear of jam near the corner of his mouth. His mother reached out to wipe it, but he ducked away playfully, declaring he could clean it himself. He grabbed his coat, zipped it up crookedly, and then fixed it with a determined tug. Before leaving, Caleb went to his small shelf and rearranged his wooden animals one more time. This time, he placed the fox at the front, as if leading the way. He stepped back to look at his arrangement, nodded with quiet approval, and then turned to fetch his school bag. When he checked its contents, he touched the sketch page lightly, then patted his marble pouch for reassurance. His world was intact, prepared, balanced in the careful way he always maintained. He walked toward the door with a mix of excitement and concentration. His father knelt to help him adjust his scarf, but Caleb insisted he could do it. His parents exchanged a glance, the bittersweet mixture of pride and unease that accompanies letting a child take a step forward alone. The door opened with a soft scrape and cold air flowed in. Caleb stepped into it with a small exhale, as though embracing the day. Dana moved to the window while Hugh walked a few steps behind their son from inside, tracking his small figure as he made his way down the block. Caleb looked back once, lifted his hand in a wave, then continued toward the corner where the bus stop stood. His steps were steady, quick, almost rhythmic, with the confidence of a routine still new enough to feel special. When he reached the lamppost near the end of the street, he paused to adjust his backpack strap. Then he looked forward again and continued walking, following the same path he had taken just the day before. That was the last moment his parents ever saw him. On the morning of April 17, 1981, the neighborhood of Northside Harbor woke slowly, wrapped in a pale layer of cloud that softened the color of everything it touched. The cobblestones looked muted, almost washed clean of contrast. Vendors moved through the square with their usual early morning shuffles, unlocking metal stalls, lifting crates of fruit and bread, and wiping down wooden counters still damp from the night's humidity. A delivery truck idled briefly near the corner, its exhaust dispersing into the cool air before it turned down Kendrick Street and disappeared. At 7:52 a.m., the Marin loft stirred with the small commotion of a school day routine. Caleb finished his toast, wiped his jam-stained fingers on a napkin, and slipped on his coat with an eagerness that masked the stiffness of the zipper. His parents watched with familiar concern, tempered by the promise they had made to trust him. When he stepped outside at 7:59, the hallway carried the faint smell of varnish and dust from the old wooden banister, the same scent it had held for years. At 8:02, he emerged onto the street. The air was cool enough that his breath formed small clouds. His shoes tapped lightly in a steady rhythm as he walked. Behind him, at their window on the third floor, Dana and Hugh kept their silent vigil, watching his shrinking figure move toward the end of the block. He lifted his hand once to wave, his fingers brushing the side of his scarf, and then he turned forward again. At 8:05, he reached the lamppost, the landmark his parents used as the boundary of their comfort. He adjusted his backpack strap in the same habitual motion he always used, tugging it twice as though testing its balance. A cyclist passed behind him, the tire treads whispering across the street. Caleb looked up briefly at the movement, then continued walking. That was the moment the neighborhood last witnessed him as part of its daily rhythm. From this point on, the timeline depends on reconstruction cross-referenced witness accounts, weather data, transit schedules, and the absence of anything definitive. At 8:07, a bakery worker named Lenora Caldwell stepped outside to empty a bucket of mop water. She later recalled seeing a small boy near the corner, possibly adjusting his shoe. She wasn't certain if it was Caleb, but the description she gave, a blue coat, a bright scarf, a small backpack, matched. She said he looked as though he was waiting for something, though she couldn't recall whether it was a person or simply the signal to cross the street. At 8:09, a postal truck made its first delivery route of the day along Marin Street. The driver, a man named Gerald, noted nothing unusual at the time, only mentioning later that the streets felt quieter than typical. The calm of that morning, he said, made it harder to remember faces or movements. By 8:12, according to transit logs, the school bus approached the designated stop but reported no child waiting. The driver remained for just under a minute before continuing the route. At that moment, the first subtle fracture in the day's routine appeared, though no one realized it yet. Between 8:05 and 8:12, somewhere along a path no more than 2 blocks long, Caleb disappeared. Northside Harbor continued with its morning as though unaware that something irrevocable had occurred. Market chatter rose and fell. The smell of baked bread drifted through the air. The newspaper vendor folded the day's papers with slow, deliberate movements. But at 8:20, in the loft overlooking the square, the steady rhythm of parental observation shifted into a hesitation that deepened into worry. Dana felt it first as a tightening in her chest, a sense that the usual time window had stretched too long. By 8:27, she had convinced herself that the bus must be late. At 8:35, she reached a threshold she could no longer ignore. She called the school, expecting reassurance, but instead was met with the first confirmation that something was wrong. He had not arrived. He had not boarded the bus. No one had seen him. At 8:41, she ran downstairs. The investigation that followed began within minutes. Hugh contacted the police while Dana retraced the route from their loft to the lamppost, calling Caleb's name in an increasingly strained voice. The street offered no response, only the morning rustle of distant traffic and the clinking of metal as vendors rearranged their displays. The first officers arrived at 8:53. They walked the block methodically, checking alleys, doorways, and recessed building entryways. A patrol officer noted the absence of scuff marks or dropped belongings. Everything on the street appeared undisturbed, as though no child had passed through it all. The lamppost where he was last seen bore no sign of struggle, no markings, nothing to indicate a sudden departure or interference. At 9:14, they expanded the search radius. The bakery, the newsstand, the tailor's shop, and a small antique store were checked. Most shopkeepers were certain they had not seen anything unusual. One elderly man reported hearing a door slam sharply around 8:10, though he could not say which building it came from. At 9:27, an officer entered the alley that ran behind the row of workshops along Harrow Street. It was a narrow lane lined with dented trash bins, broken pallets, and stray cardboard. The air smelled faintly of engine oil and rain-soaked timber. Along the wall of one workshop, a faint streak of blue chalk sat on the bricks at the height of a child's hand. The mark was smudged, barely discernible, and could have been days old. It was noted, photographed, and ultimately added to a growing list of ambiguous clues. At 9:41, a search dog was brought in. It followed Caleb's scent as far as the lamppost, then wavered, paced in a small loop, and stopped abruptly. The dog's behavior suggested a break in the trail, as though the scent simply ended. This finding created the first major concern among investigators, a possibility that someone had lifted the child from the ground quickly, preventing further trace. Throughout the morning, neighbors gathered in small clusters, exchanging fragments of recollection. One woman thought she saw a man in a brown coat standing near the bus stop earlier than usual. Another remembered a white van parked briefly near the alley before driving off. But each detail lacked consistency. Times contradicted other accounts. Descriptions blurred between memory and assumption. At 10:22, officers located a small object near the edge of a drainage grate at the corner of Kendrick Street. It was a marble, smooth, translucent blue, resting half hidden in dust. It matched the type Caleb was known to carry. The discovery sent a ripple of fear through the assembled crowd. The marble itself was pristine, with no signs of impact or dirt embedded in its surface. It was placed into an evidence bag, marked with time and location, and photographed against the gray street. This was the first physical object definitively tied to the boy. The meaning of the marble remained unclear. It could have fallen from his pouch as he walked. It could have been dropped in a moment of distraction. It could have been placed there. None of the possibilities provided clarity. By late morning, at 11:03, officers received a report from a tool repairman who worked in the building adjacent to the alley. He claimed he heard footsteps running around 8:10, fast and heavy, unlike the usual foot traffic. When asked to describe the sound, he struggled to articulate it, finally settling on a comparison. Someone moving quickly, but trying hard not to be noticed. The report was taken seriously, but remained unverified. At 11:17, another ambiguous clue surfaced. A folded piece of paper was found beneath the grate, near where the marble had been located. It was damp and difficult to unfold without tearing. On it were faint traces of crayon strokes, mostly smeared into indistinct patches of color. Experts later compared it to pages from Caleb's sketchbook, but could not confirm its origin. It lacked any identifying marking, yet the possibility gnawed at investigators, creating a thread of suspicion that connected this scrap to the boy's drawings. By noon, the tone of the search had shifted. The calm precision of the morning had dissolved into urgency. Police began canvassing buildings more aggressively. Volunteers joined the search, calling the boy's name into alleys and stairwells. The air felt heavier, not from weather, but from accumulating fear. At 1:42 p.m., officers conducted a floor-by-floor search of the workshop building on Harrow Street. The ground-level rooms contained nothing unusual. Old tools, coils of rope, boxes of nails, piles of lumber. But on the basement door of the central workshop, a rusted padlock hung at an odd angle, as though recently disturbed. The officer who inspected it noted that the latch had been scraped clean in a narrow line, as if something had pressed against it with force. The observation was not enough to justify forced entry at the time, and the detail went into the report without further action. This decision later became one of the most scrutinized moments of the early investigation. The rest of the day yielded no further physical evidence. No new witnesses came forward. No vehicles matching descriptions were located. As evening fell, the light thinning into gray, the absence of the boy grew more profound. The day ended with unanswered questions and a widening sense of dread. And yet, one detail continued to trouble investigators. The blue marble found near the drainage grate was the only object out of place in an otherwise undisturbed environment. It seemed to sit there with intention, almost too visible, too clean, too perfectly positioned to be accidental. The unanswered question lingered. How had it landed there, untouched and unscarred, on a morning when the boy had simply vanished? In the days following Caleb's disappearance, the investigation swelled with urgency. The streets of Northside Harbor filled with officers, volunteers, and neighbors who moved through alleys, stairwells, and basements with a mixture of determination and disbelief. Everyone expected a breakthrough, a quick answer, a clue that would unravel the small window of time in which the boy vanished. For the first week, this hope sustained the search. But as the days stretched into weeks, then months, it became clear that whatever happened to Caleb had slipped past the early net of the investigation, leaving behind only fragments that pointed nowhere. The first major lead came on the fifth day. A street vendor claimed he had seen a boy matching Caleb's description, speaking with a man in a brown coat near the bus stop. The vendor's voice trembled as he described the man's posture, leaning slightly, one hand in his pocket, as though trying to appear casual. Detectives seized on the detail, canvassing the neighborhood for anyone wearing a coat of that description. They questioned workers, commuters, and regulars who passed through the square. By the end of the week, they had identified a local carpenter named Martin Lyle, whose coat roughly matched the vendor's memory. He was brought in for questioning. His hands shook when asked about his movements that morning. He claimed he had been repairing a window frame on Olive Street. When pressed, he grew anxious, as though the pressure of the room had tightened around him. Investigators recorded every hesitation, every breath. Later that afternoon, his alibi was confirmed by his employer and two co-workers who had seen him at the job site before sunrise. The tension drained from the room, replaced by the familiar dull ache of another path closing. The vendor later admitted he might have mistaken the day, or the coat, or the boy entirely. A week later, another lead surfaced when a homeless man told officers he had seen a child being pushed into a white van near Kendrick Street. The tip led to a frantic sweep of traffic logs, parking permits, and businesses that owned similar vehicles. 3 white vans were located, inspected, and cleared by midday. The homeless man, found again for clarification, struggled to maintain his version of events. His recollection shifted each time, the details unraveling until nothing reliable remained. Throughout the first month, the Marin family sat through countless interviews with detectives who tried to thread together any detail that could provide insight. They answered questions about Caleb's habits, fears, friendships, and routines. Each interview felt like reopening a wound. Dana once asked an investigator, "Is there something we're missing? Something he didn't tell us?" The detective paused before replying gently, "Children don't always know they're in danger." It was a sentence that would echo in her mind for years. By summer, the early leads had grown thin. The chalk mark on the workshop wall was tested, but no traceable material could be recovered. It could have been from Caleb, or another child, or even a worker dragging supplies. The scrap of crayon-colored paper found near the drainage grate was analyzed, preserved, and debated endlessly. Experts compared fiber composition to Caleb's sketchbook, but could make no definitive claim. Without clarity, the question hung in the air like a suspended breath. Coincidence or evidence? Then came the case of the quiet neighbor. 6 weeks after the disappearance, officers revisited the residents of the building adjacent to the alley. Among them was a man named Ilias Drexler, a handyman who lived alone and worked sporadically around the neighborhood. He had been interviewed briefly on the morning of the disappearance. His statement at the time was unremarkable. He said he had been asleep until after 9 a.m., had heard nothing unusual, and had never seen the boy. Investigators initially dismissed him as irrelevant. But in midsummer, a neighbor reported an odd smell coming from Drexler's workshop. When officers visited, they found only a pile of rotting wood soaked with rainwater, the odor explained, the suspicion fading as quickly as it had formed. Drexler responded to the questions politely, if somewhat nervously. When asked again about the morning of April 17th, he gave the same answer he had given before, almost word for word, raising a quiet suspicion that he had rehearsed the memory. But without evidence, the police had nothing to hold him on. 2 months later, a group of neighborhood children found a small brown leather strap near the pier. The strap looked like it could have come from a child's bag. It was turned over to authorities, sparking a surge of hope that perhaps this was the missing link. But laboratory analysis concluded it belonged to a fisherman's tackle pouch. That hope evaporated as quickly as it had surfaced. During the fall, investigators received a flood of tips from outside the city. A woman in upstate New York claimed she had seen a child resembling Caleb in a grocery store. Another caller believed he had spotted the boy at a gas station near a rural highway. But each sighting dissolved under scrutiny. The children in the reports were real, but had no connection to the case. Each misidentification added to the emotional toll the family endured. Dana and Hugh tried to maintain their footing in the storm. They distributed flyers, appeared on local broadcasts, and spoke to anyone who might have information. Dana once pleaded on a news segment, her voice trembling, "If you know anything, even something small, please come forward." It was a quiet appeal that reflected both desperation and heartbreaking endurance. Through the winter, detectives expanded their radius. They revisited factories, abandoned buildings, and transit stations. They traveled as far as 2 counties away, following rumors of a drifter who had been seen near the square. The drifter was eventually located, a man with a troubled history and a tendency to move without pattern. He answered questions with a mixture of confusion and agitation. Investigators searched his belongings, his campsite, and the pockets of his worn jacket. They found nothing linking him to the child. A detective later described that interview as chasing smoke through fog. By early 1982, the weight of the investigation began to settle in uncomfortable ways. The precinct's morale waned. Meetings became shorter, more perfunctory. Officers who once pored over documents began to succumb to fatigue, moving slowly through tasks that had once sparked urgency. The Marin family felt this shift acutely. They noticed the change in tone during check-ins, no longer energetic, no longer filled with new angles. Instead, the conversations became quieter, marked by phrases like "we're still looking" and "we haven't ruled anything out," which felt increasingly hollow. At one meeting, Dana confronted one of the lead detectives. "Are you giving up?" she asked, her voice steady but breaking beneath the surface. The detective hesitated before replying, "We're not giving up, but we are running out of places to look." It was not an admission anyone wanted to hear. In the second year of the investigation, the case expanded in a new direction: the possibility of abduction by someone passing through the area. The theory grew from the lack of local evidence and the clean disappearance. Officers worked with state authorities to cross-check arrest records of individuals involved in similar cases. Several names surfaced, but none matched the timeline or geography. Investigators also examined the possibility of accidental harm followed by concealment. They interviewed construction workers who had been refurbishing nearby buildings, questioning whether an accident on a worksite could have led to panic. But records and testimonies yielded no supporting evidence. Every lead, however promising it first appeared, dissolved into the fog of uncertainty. In the third year, attention shifted briefly to a school janitor who had once lived in Northside Harbor. His sudden departure from the district after the disappearance raised questions. He was tracked to a town several miles away. Officers interviewed him and found him cooperative, if startled by the sudden intrusion into his life. His explanation for leaving, a family emergency, was verified. The suspicion evaporated as cleanly as the others. The years that followed grew heavier with each passing milestone of absence. Birthdays came and went. Vigils formed in the plaza where Caleb once walked. Neighbors lit candles at dusk, watching the small flames tremble. Some believed the case would eventually be solved. Others quietly accepted that the answers might never surface. Detectives who had worked the case from the beginning began retiring or shifting to other departments. Their replacements inherited boxes of reports, photographs, and evidence bags. New officers pored over the material with fresh eyes, but the same walls remained: the marble, the lamppost, the gap between 8:05 and 8:12, the silence where certainty should have been. The Marins continued to cooperate with every new suggestion, every new attempt. They attended community meetings, kept their contact information updated, and maintained the hope that someday, someone would come forward with the final missing piece. But by the late 1980s, the case showed unmistakable signs of slowing. Funding for wide-scale searches diminished. The frequency of updates dwindled. The momentum that once defined the investigation now flickered like a dying ember. One of the last major reviews came in 1991, led by a detective who had not been part of the original team. He revisited every witness statement, re-examined the physical evidence, and even re-interviewed individuals who had long moved on from Northside Harbor. When he reached the end of the files, he wrote a short internal memo summarizing his findings. It ended with a single line that struck everyone who read it. "The trail ends in silence, and there is no direction left to follow." He did not mean it as an official closure, but it felt like one. By the mid-1990s, the case file was moved to long-term storage. Not closed, not forgotten entirely, but placed among other unresolved stories that rested in the dim quiet of the precinct archives. The box containing Caleb's case was marked with a fading label, the ink slightly smudged. The corner of the box had begun to soften from age. And though no one said the words aloud, the truth was unmistakable. The investigation had reached its limit. The last pages of the file carried no breakthroughs, no final revelations, only echoes of the questions that had haunted the community since that morning. The chapter of active pursuit had ended, leaving behind the hollow weight of a story with no conclusion. In the years after the searches ended and the neighborhood returned to its ordinary routines, the Marin Loft remained a place where time seemed unwilling to move forward. The sun still touched the brick walls in the mornings, but its warmth felt muted, as though it understood that this home no longer woke with the same gentle rhythm. Dana kept the curtains open every day, even during rainstorms, believing that light should always have permission to enter the space where her son had once stood. Hugh continued checking the mailbox each evening, though the only letters that arrived were bills or community newsletters. Neither of them spoke about the habit directly, yet they both knew why it remained. The first decade passed slowly, marked by the kinds of changes that appear subtle until someone stops to notice how much has shifted. The pencil marks on Caleb's bedroom doorframe remained at the same height. His wooden animal stayed in the last arrangement he made, a quiet tableau of a fox leading the others. His marbles, cleaned and counted each night during his last weeks, stayed tucked inside their cloth pouch in the top drawer of his desk. Dana dusted around these objects with delicate movements, as though they were too fragile to disturb. Friends and neighbors visited less often as the years progressed, not because they cared less, but because grief tends to make people unsure of their place. They brought food during holidays, left small gifts at the door, or sent cards with handwritten messages that grew shorter each year. One card simply read, "Thinking of you both." Another, written by an elderly neighbor who could barely hold her pen steady, said, "Some children belong to time itself." Donna cried quietly when she read that one, not because the words were wrong, but because they captured something she had never dared to articulate. By the early 1990s, Northside Harbor had changed enough that the familiar sounds of Caleb's childhood were no longer recognizable. The market square grew busier. New businesses took over the older workshops. Murals appeared on walls that had once been plain brick. And yet, in the midst of all this growth, one corner of the neighborhood stood unchanged, the lamppost where he had last been seen. People walked past it without noticing, but for Dana and Hugh, it remained a fixed point in a landscape that otherwise drifted steadily away from the past. They visited it every year on his birthday. Some years they placed flowers at its base. Other years they simply stood in silence and allowed their memories to fill the space where words no longer sufficed. The ritual was not spoken about. It simply persisted like an echo that refused to fade. As the second decade approached, the case lived on mostly through small community efforts. A local reporter wrote an anniversary article each year, though these pieces eventually became shorter and less detailed. Once, the reporter interviewed Hugh outside a neighborhood cafe. He asked what kept them going after so much time. Hugh's answer was simple. "Hope changes shape," he said. "It gets quieter, but it doesn't disappear." The reporter included the quote near the end of the article. For a brief week afterward, strangers approached them with gentle nods, acknowledging the endurance their family had carried for so long. Dana found her own way of continuing the story. She started writing letters addressed to Caleb, short notes, reflections, moments from her day. She never intended to send them anywhere. She slid each letter into a box she kept under their bed. Some letters were only a few sentences. Others filled several pages. Many began with the same phrase, "I wonder what you would have become in time." The box grew heavy, the paper bending from years of being pressed together. In 1998, a documentary team briefly revived interest in the case. They interviewed the Marins, former detectives, and members of the community. For weeks, equipment, lights, and questions filled the loft. The documentary aired once, late at night, and though it drew sympathy from viewers, it produced no new leads. It did, however, give Dana and Hugh one small gift: the feeling that their son had not been forgotten. Not entirely. Sometimes they watched the recording late at night, not looking for answers, but seeking the comfort of recognition. Time continued forward in its unyielding way, leaving behind a trail of birthdays, seasons, and anniversaries. Hugh's hair grayed. Dana's hands developed the fine tremors of age. Their steps slowed and their conversations deepened into quiet companionship. But their home, though aged in its own ways, remained carefully untouched in the spaces where their son once lived. The world around them shifted faster as the new century arrived. The city upgraded its street lamps to brighter models, but the old lamppost where he had last stood was never removed. By then, it had become more than infrastructure. It was a landmark of memory. People in the neighborhood whispered about it the way they might whisper about a piece of history. "That's where the boy was last seen," they would say. The sentence lingered in the air, softened by compassion rather than curiosity. During those later years, Hugh began organizing a small annual vigil in the plaza. At first, only close friends attended, but eventually, others joined: retired teachers, neighbors who had moved away and returned, strangers who had read about the case. Candles formed small circles of light against the evening dusk. People bowed their heads, not in mourning alone but in quiet solidarity. The Marins never asked for these gatherings, but they stood among the candles each year, grateful for the kindness that surfaced even in long stretches of silence. And still, the investigation remained dormant. Boxes of evidence gathered dust in the precinct archives. Reports yellowed at the edges. Photographs lost their clarity. Detectives retired. New recruits glanced briefly at the old file during training, recognizing the name but not the deeper story. For many, it was simply one of the city's long-standing mysteries. But for the Marins, it was a life paused. In 2007, Dana wrote one of her longest letters. It spanned several pages, reflecting on the differences she imagined in the boy he would have become, how he might have walked, spoken, or laughed. She wrote, "People say time heals, but time also erases. I refuse to let it erase you." When she finished the letter, she folded it carefully and placed it into the box, now nearly full. As technology advanced, the family wondered whether new tools might finally answer the questions that had long tormented them. They followed news stories about cold cases solved by forensic advancements. Hugh clipped articles about breakthroughs and archived evidence. He saved an article titled "Old Cases, New Science" and placed it on the kitchen table. Dana read it with a mix of hope and caution. It spoke of digital enhancement, forensic imaging, and data systems that could revive old files. She traced the headline with her fingertips, thinking of the box beneath their bed, the box in the precinct archives, the box at the heart of their grief. Then came the anniversary of the disappearance in 2016, a quiet morning filled with an ache they had learned to recognize instantly. They walked to the lamppost again, leaning against each other in a gesture shaped by years of shared endurance. The city around them felt louder, faster, and more modern than the one their son had known. Cars lined the streets in neat rows. New cafes hosted morning crowds. The square bustled with vendors younger than the case itself. When they returned home, the phone rang. It was not the school or the press or a neighbor. It was a retired detective they had not heard from in years. Her voice carried a tone they had almost forgotten: focus. Not certainty, not celebration, but the unmistakable weight of attention. "I was digitizing old interviews," she said. "I found something unusual." Dana pressed the phone against her ear, hardly breathing. "It might be nothing," the detective continued, "but it's worth looking at again." It was the first time in decades that someone had spoken of the case, not as a memory, but as a possibility. The words lingered in the air like the faint flicker of candlelight. Hope, quiet and trembling, stirred within them not as the bright spark of early days, but as something gentler, older, and deeply resilient. "Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments." The box arrived at the forensic center on a quiet spring afternoon, its metal surface still coated with the dust of decades. Technicians moved it carefully onto a table lined with protective film, their movements measured, as though aware they were touching something that had waited for this moment longer than most of them had been alive. The tag on the side bore the new case code, but beneath it, the faded handwriting from the original file could still be read. It felt like a bridge across time. Retired Detective Marley Yates stood in the observation room, watching the team prepare. She had found the trunk in the basement of the old workshop 2 days earlier, prying it open with equal parts dread and determination. Since then, she had replayed the moment countless times, the lid lifting, the stale air escaping, the first sight of the blue canvas shoe resting inside. She had no illusions about certainty, but a feeling had settled in her chest, steady and quiet, that the silence surrounding the case was finally beginning to fracture. The technicians examined the trunk first, documenting every dent and flake of paint. They used angled lights to reveal patterns of wear, noting the scratches around the latch and the way the bottom plate had shifted over time. Then they moved to extract each object: the shoe, the folded sketchbook page, the cloth pouch holding marbles, and the small market token. Each item was placed into its own container, labeled and sealed. The shoe was the first to undergo analysis. Under magnification, the sole revealed tiny grains embedded in the crevices. The forensic geologist scraped a few particles onto a slide, and minutes later, the screen displayed a crystalline pattern unique to a mixture of lime dust and old seawall grit. This combination matched soil samples from construction debris near the Marin Loft in 1981, a detail archived in the original case notes but long overlooked. The match did not prove the shoe belonged to Caleb, but it placed the object in the geography of his final known route. Thread analysis followed. The Velcro flap carried a pale fiber that technicians treated with extraordinary care. Under polarized light, the weave pattern became visible, a cotton blend textile manufactured in the late 1970s. A comparison with fibers, collected from items in the Marin home decades earlier, revealed a compatible pattern. It was not definitive, but it was consistent, one more thread connecting the object to the child the case had lost. The sketchbook page revealed even more. It was brittle, the edges uneven, but the crayon strokes remained. A small harbor drawing, unfinished. When scanned using digital enhancement technology, the page revealed indentations from markings on top of it, faint lines suggesting numbers, possibly dates or times. One technician muttered a quiet note of disbelief when the enhanced imaging revealed a sequence resembling 4/16, the day before the disappearance, though the imprint was faint enough to leave room for doubt. Still, the significance of the date pulled the room into a hush. The marbles were pristine, surprisingly so. Their surfaces bore none of the scratches typical of toys carried loosely in a pocket. This detail troubled the analysts. Had they been kept apart from the boys' play? Or were they placed in the pouch shortly before being hidden away? The marbles offered no further secrets, but the pouch they rested in carried microscopic flecks of sawdust, the type found on tools stored in Drexler's workshop during that period. It was not until a technician noticed an odd shift in the trunk's base that the breakthrough took on a deeper dimension. Running a density scan, she found a second compartment, a slim cavity beneath the main storage area. The team opened it with needle tools and delicate pressure. What emerged was a small notebook, its leather cover warped with age and faint water damage. The pages inside were stuck together along one edge, but with patient handling, they separated. The handwriting within was uneven, hurried, and punctuated with incomplete thoughts. Dates appeared sporadically, along with observations about the neighborhood. One page read, "The boy who walks alone at 8." Another listed times that matched the bus schedule from that period. One page, scrawled more shakily, ended mid-sentence, "He trusted me. I didn't mean." Technicians exchanged glances. Some pages contained lists of repair jobs. Drexler performed near the Marin loft in early 1981. Several entries tracked Caleb's routine, noting movements that a casual observer would not have memorized. The notebook changed the tone of the entire investigation. What had once seemed like a random disappearance began to take on the shape of deliberate intent, marked by surveillance and quiet fixation. While the notebook was being photographed, another technician announced a discovery from the trunk's interior edge. A thin fragment of wood consistent with the type used in the basement's shelving in 1981. It was a minor detail, but it tied the trunk not only to the workshop, but to the specific part of the building that Drexler had denied ever using in his original statement. As the evidence accumulated, the investigative unit reconvened. Marla Yates sat with them, her retired status overridden by the historical weight she carried. The younger detectives looked to her with a mixture of curiosity and respect, bridging the generational gap the case had created. She summarized the inconsistencies from the original interview, the basement Drexler claimed never to enter, and the logistical reality that only someone with building access could have placed the trunk where it remained hidden for decades. One detective asked quietly, "Do you think he kept these things on purpose, or was it a panic reaction?" Marla considered the question before answering. "It feels like someone who didn't know what to do and never found the nerve to undo it." As word of the breakthrough spread through the department, the case's dormant components stirred to life. Files were pulled from storage, archived tapes were digitized. Analysts revisited old transcripts with modern tools that could isolate background noises or enhance faded audio. One such enhancement revealed a soft clatter during Drexler's 1981 interview, a sound previously dismissed as static. Now, with clearer processing, the clatter resembled the noise of marble striking a metal surface. It was not conclusive evidence, but it deepened the unease around his original statement. The precinct released a cautious internal update, and within days, the Marins received a call. When they arrived at the station, they were led to a quiet room where the items recovered from the trunk rested under soft lighting. Dana reached for the edge of the table but stopped short of touching the glass above the shoe. Hugh stood beside her, his breath unsteady. A forensic specialist explained each item with gentle clarity, where it had been found, what analyses had shown, what remained uncertain. When the notebook was placed on the table, Dana closed her eyes as though steadying herself against a wave of unseen weight. Hugh asked to see one page in particular, the one referencing the boy walking alone. The words, though simple, felt unbearably heavy. "What happens now?" he asked. Marla answered, her voice measured but carrying a strength they had not heard in decades. "Now we take this further. We're no longer in the dark." The community reacted with mixed emotions when the news reached them. Some felt relief that the silence might finally break. Others, older residents who had lived through the original searches, felt the stirring of old fear. Candles reappeared outside the lamppost, flickering against the evening breeze. A note left under one candle read, "We never stopped hoping." In the following weeks, the evidence from the trunk formed the backbone of a renewed investigative effort. The trunk itself became an anchor, a physical piece of the story that had endured the passage of time. Every analysis, fingerprint test, and digital enhancement added another stroke to a picture that had remained blank for 35 years. The breakthrough did not provide all answers, but it created a path, something the case had lacked since the earliest days. For the Marins, the shift was palpable. The ache remained, but it no longer lived in isolation. There was movement again, possibility again. A sense that the story which had once ended abruptly might now continue towards something resembling truth. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The decision to bring Elias Drexler in for questioning again came quietly, shaped not by urgency, but by a steady accumulation of facts that had grown too heavy to ignore. Detectives arrived at his small apartment on a warm evening in early summer. The door opened slowly when they knocked, revealing a man whose age seemed to have multiplied in the years since the first interview. His hair had thinned, his posture slumped, and his eyes carried the restless flicker of someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding certain corners of his own memory. The detectives asked him to come to the precinct to clarify details from the past. He hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the small workshop tools scattered on his table, remnants of a routine that had become his shield. When he finally agreed, the motion seemed weighted, as if he already sensed that this time would not end as the others had. The officers guided him toward the car, not with force, but with the quiet finality of a chapter long overdue. At the precinct, Drexler sat in the interview room with his hands folded tightly, so rigid that the knuckles turned pale. The investigators spoke with calm, measured voices, presenting him with the findings, the trunk, the objects inside, the notebook from the hidden compartment, the fibers, the soil, the sawdust. They asked him to explain how these items had ended up in a basement he claimed never to have entered. His silence stretched until it felt like an answer in itself. When he finally spoke, his words came haltingly. He said he didn't remember writing the notebook entries. He said he couldn't explain the shoe. He said he had been under stress at the time, overwhelmed, confused. His voice faltered when they read aloud the line from the notebook. "He trusted me." "I didn't mean." The unfinished sentence hung between them with a weight that pressed against the room. For several hours, the questioning continued. The investigators never raised their voices. They simply presented the truth piece by piece, allowing the accumulation to create its own pressure. Drexler's composure wavered. His hands shook. At one point, he murmured something barely audible, a fragmented phrase that one detective leaned forward to catch. "I should have said something back then," but he refused to elaborate. By the end of the night, there was enough to make the arrest official. When the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he did not resist. His head lowered, not in defiance but in resignation, as though he had spent years rehearsing this moment in the privacy of his conscience. The news spread through the city by morning. Reports noted the arrest of a longtime resident connected to the disappearance of a child 35 years earlier. Older residents recognized the name instantly. The plaza filled with murmured conversations, disbelief mixed with quiet acceptance. Some felt vindicated, others felt only sorrow. The courtroom opened several months later. Crowds gathered early, lining the hallway outside. The air inside held the solemnity of an event shaped by decades of unanswered grief. Families of missing children from other cases attended, offering silent solidarity. The Marins sat near the front, hands intertwined, their faces lined with the weight of years carried without resolution. The courtroom's atmosphere felt heavy, the kind of heaviness that settles over people who have waited too long for answers. Light filtered through high windows, illuminating dust and slow drifting trails. Conversations dropped to whispers. Every movement felt amplified by the stillness. When Drexler entered, escorted by deputies, the room exhaled a collective breath. He walked slowly, eyes fixed on the floor. His shoulders hunched, as if shielding himself from the weight of the attention he could no longer avoid. He did not look toward the Marins. Dana watched him with a steady expression, searching not for vengeance but for understanding. Hugh's grip on her hand strengthened, steadying them both. The prosecution presented its case methodically. They detailed the trunk, the location where it was found, and the exclusive access Drexler had to the basement in 1981. They showed images of the shoe, the marbles, the sketchbook page. They displayed the notebook on a stand, turning each page slowly so the court could see the uneven handwriting. They highlighted the entries that referenced the boy's routine, the times he walked alone, and the places he could be found. The pages spoke more loudly than any witness could. Specialists from the forensic center explained the soil match, the fiber pattern, and the sawdust particles embedded in the cloth pouch. They spoke in calm, precise language, the kind that leaves little room for misinterpretation. One analyst described how the notebook had likely remained undisturbed since the early 1980s, hidden in the compartment beneath the trunk. Quiet murmurs moved through the courtroom as she explained the significance of the indentation marks on the drawing page, linking it indirectly to the morning before the disappearance. The defense attempted to argue memory lapse, contamination of evidence, and the unreliability of recollections from decades earlier. They suggested that Drexler had been a reclusive man, more afraid of interactions than capable of deliberate harm. They emphasized that the notebook lacked explicit confession, but the argument faltered when weighed against the physical objects that placed the child's belongings squarely in spaces Drexler occupied and controlled. The courtroom's tension peaked when the prosecution read aloud the unfinished line from the notebook. The words seemed to freeze everything for a moment. The silence that followed felt deeper than anything else in the trial. Dana lowered her head. Hugh closed his eyes. Even the judge paused before continuing. After several days of testimony, the courtroom reached its final moment. The jury filed in, their expressions solemn. The foreperson stood, reading the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. The words carried through the room like the closing of a long-held breath. Guilty on all applicable counts. A soundless wave moved across the crowd. Shock, relief, sorrow, acceptance. Drexler's shoulders slumped further. He did not look up. The deputies led him away quietly as he muttered an indistinct phrase, almost swallowed in the air. Dana and Hugh did not cheer, nor did they cry. Instead, they held each other's hands, grounding themselves in the moment that had eluded them for so long. For them, justice was not a celebration. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that the truth had finally surfaced, imperfect and incomplete, but real. After the verdict, Marla joined them outside the courthouse. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the steps. She spoke to them with an honesty shaped by years of regret. She apologized for the early missteps, for the missed details, for the silence that had lasted too long. Hugh placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You brought him back into the light. That's what matters now." The Marins returned home that night to a loft unchanged by the years, yet transformed by the knowledge that the silence had finally broken. Dana opened the box of letters beneath their bed and placed one final note inside, not addressed to the past but to the present. It read, "We found something today, not everything, but enough. The city moved forward, but the lamppost remained. People still passed it without noticing, unaware of the story it anchored. But for those who had lived through the decades of waiting, it stood as a quiet monument, a reminder that even in the long shadows of uncertainty, truth can still rise." Justice had not erased the years of absence, but it had given them a boundary, a place where the story could rest, no longer drifting in the dark. In the months after the verdict, the city adjusted to a quieter version of the story that had once shaken it. The courthouse steps no longer drew crowds, and the plaza returned to its steady rhythm of morning deliveries and murmured greetings. But beneath the familiar routines, something had shifted. People paused a little longer when passing the old lamppost. They noticed the way the light touched its metal surface in early morning, soft and pale, the way it once had on the day a small boy walked toward it for the last time. For Dana and Hugh, life did not return to what it had been, nor did they expect it to. Instead, their days began to take on a gentle steadiness, a rhythm shaped not by waiting for answers, but by learning how to live with the ones they finally had. They still kept Caleb's room unchanged, but now the door stood slightly open, not closed. Dana no longer dusted around the objects as though they might break. She touched them with the quiet reverence of someone honoring what remains rather than mourning what is lost. The box of letters under the bed grew heavier by only one more page, the final note she added after the trial, the one written in a hand steadier than she expected. Sometimes she reread it, not for reassurance, but for the reminder that closure does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appears in a single sentence, a single moment that signals a different kind of tomorrow. Marla Yates found her own form of peace. She continued assisting the younger detectives for a while, guiding them through archived cases with the perspective of someone who had seen how silence can hide the truth for half a lifetime. She spoke softly about persistence, about the value of revisiting what once seemed impossible, about the necessity of listening to the faint echoes left in old evidence. She never claimed victory. She simply carried the case with her as a reminder of why she joined the profession in the first place. As for Northside Harbor, the neighborhood aged, but it never forgot the story that had shaped it. A small memorial plaque was placed near the lamppost, nothing dramatic, just a simple engraved line that read, "In memory of those who are missing, and for those who wait." People stopped to read it, some placing a candle or a folded note beneath it. Others simply walked past with a quiet nod, acknowledging the history embedded in the street. Every year on the date of Caleb's disappearance, a light rain often settled over the city, the kind that stays suspended in the air like a fine mist. Dana liked to think of it as the weather remembering. She and Hugh would walk to the plaza, stand beneath the lamppost, and let the damp air rest against their faces. They didn't speak much during those moments. They didn't need to. The silence felt different, now less like an unanswered question, and more like a space they had finally learned how to share. What the case taught them, and the city, was something both simple and profound: that time does not erase truth. It only delays it. Evidence waits. Memory waits. And sometimes, even in the quietest corners of a forgotten building, the past holds on until someone comes looking again. The objects from the trunk were eventually preserved in the archives, documented with care. They were no longer just remnants of a missing child's routine. They had become symbols of how a single thread of detail, overlooked for decades, could pull the entire story back into light. The marbles, the sketchbook page, the shoe, each one carried a softness that contrasted the enormity of what they represented. They reminded everyone who saw them that the smallest things often matter the most. In the end, the Marins learned to live not with certainty, but with acceptance. Their grief remained, but its edges softened. They found themselves looking toward mornings with a quiet steadiness, stepping into days that no longer felt suspended. Justice had not undone the loss, but it had given shape to the years that followed it. It had allowed them to breathe differently. And for a city that once held its breath in fear, the story left behind a message that resonated long after the trial ended. Even in the deepest silence, truth has a way of rising. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.